So I have this truly creepy, eerie memory of being home alone when I was a little kid. My recollection of it is so dreamlike that I genuinely believed it was only a dream for most of my adult life. Then, years later, my mom mentioned the incident, and I casually remarked that I had thought it never really happened. She said she remembered me thinking that for years. That was when I realized I had a real scary memory, not some forgettable dream. And I think I preferred it when I believed it was only a dream. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, and everything felt heavy and still. There is a feeling when you can sense your house is empty, even without any clear reason, and that was exactly how it felt. I was around 4 years old, and it was the middle of the night, which made everything deeply unsettling to me. I wandered out of my room and into my parents' bedroom. I was too short to reach any light switches, so I had to rely on the moonlight and whatever faint light was available. I could see that my parents' bed was empty, so I went downstairs looking for them. In the living room, the television was on, playing nothing but static, which immediately made me uneasy. I have no idea what time of night it was, or why any station would show only static, but that is what I remember. I also remember strange red lights flickering through the house. Next, I went into the kitchen, trying to find any sign of my parents. At first, I did not notice her sitting there in the darkness, Mrs. Holloway. When she spoke, it made me jump. I tried to reach the light switch because there was a stool in the kitchen that I could climb onto to turn it on. However, Mrs. Holloway told me not to turn on the light, so I didn't. I could barely see her shape outlined by the moonlight as she sat at the kitchen table. The strangest part is that, to this day, I would swear she was completely naked. Why that did not alarm me as a little kid, I do not know, but I accepted it without question at the time. She explained that she was the neighbor and that my parents had asked her to come over to watch me. She said that Mommy and Daddy had to go away, but she was here now and would always be here. Before I had a chance to fully take in her words, I heard the sound of the front door unlocking and opening. Immediately, I ran into the hallway and saw my parents coming through the door. They turned on the lights right away, and my mom pulled me into her arms, holding me tight, apologizing for leaving me alone. I told them it was okay, that Mrs. Holloway had come to watch me and said she would stay with me. When they asked where she was, I told them she was in the kitchen. The next thing I remember is being in that kitchen, my dad switching on the light, and the chair where Mrs. Holloway had been sitting tipped over on the floor, with the back door standing wide open. When my mom mentioned the incident again years later, I asked if she remembered anything beyond what I had already shared. She added that both of them had gone out into the gravel front lot because there had been a house fire nearby in Riverside Heights. Like many of the neighbors, they stepped outside after being woken by the red lights of fire trucks and paramedics. That explains why the memory always feels faintly red-tinted to me. According to my mom, I told them Mrs. Holloway had come to take me away, not to watch me. I also told them she was not wearing any clothes, and that I did not like her, and that I was glad my parents came home when they did. From the way my mom remembers it, Mrs. Holloway was close to leaving with me. She said they asked me about it carefully, trying not to frighten me. I described a very old, naked woman who had been waiting in the kitchen and trying to convince me to go with her. Another strange detail is that as a small child, I kept describing the woman as slimy or covered in slime, even though I could never explain what that meant. My mom said they found a jar of some condiment on the table with a clear, unknown substance smeared on it, which oddly supported my claim that the woman was slimy. That detail was new to me as well. I do not remember the slime at all, and it is not something my elderly mother would have invented on her own. My mom says they were only gone from the house for about 5 minutes, and that they always wondered whether Riverside Heights fire and the naked, slimy Mrs. Holloway were connected. Maybe the substance covering her was some kind of accelerant, and that would be my guess. It's good to know I didn't just dream about some creepy, naked Mrs. Holloway when I was a little kid. But knowing the memory is real doesn't make me feel very safe when I'm home alone, even now, well into my 30s. So I have a story that's become something of a legend in my family. It's a strangely fond memory, even though it was absolutely terrifying at the time. I think you can understand why I still appreciate it, even now. Back when this happened, my dad was a park ranger assigned to a range near Cape Horn Lookout. He and my mom separated shortly after I was born, and our relationship was always a little strained. I don't mean to imply that my dad was absent in a careless way. He just wasn't the type who planned to settle down and raise a family. It was a big adjustment for him, and when he did try, he genuinely did his best. But he wasn't always around, and sometimes I'd go months without hearing from him. As I got older, I learned not to take that personally. Dad was what people called a wandering soul. He needed to be out in nature to feel alive, and being a park ranger, caring for others in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, was truly his calling. As a boy, there were plenty of times when I was angry at my father for not being around like other dads, or for not having a place I could easily visit every other weekend. As I grew up and became a man, though, I started to respect and relate to him more, especially after he passed away. I have many fond memories and wild stories about my dad, mostly from when I was older. This is one of the rare stories from when I was still young, and it's a story where my father is notable for not being there. Let me explain. Dad was the kind of ranger who moved between different parks, but after he became a father, he tried to settle into something more permanent and took a post near Cape Horn Lookout. He had a small but tidy cabin there, which meant he finally had a place where I could safely visit and stay, especially once I turned 10. I was at a point in my life where I had grown out of being a bratty kid, but I wasn't quite a too cool for school teenager yet. So that summer, my dad was my hero. We did so much cool stuff together: fishing, animal spotting, hiking, and exploring around Cape Horn Lookout. Like any hot-blooded ranger's son, I was absolutely fascinated by the Cascade Sasquatch folklore around the area. Dad would roll his eyes and indulge me whenever I asked him to tell me about the big old mountain men and women, I assumed, who were rumored to live and hunt in the area. Dad always preferred talking about other, more tangibly real animals, but I always wanted to hear about Bigfoot. To me, the appeal was obvious. They are genuinely fascinating cryptids, whether you believe they exist or not. But as for me, listen to my story, and then decide which camp I fall into. Now, it was late evening when Dad got the call. A search and rescue operation was underway some ways down the park, and they absolutely needed all hands on deck. Dad argued, swore, and insisted that he wasn't happy leaving his son back at the cabin, and we had movie night planned. But then he sat me down, and we talked about it. He explained how this job meant that sometimes people's lives were in his hands, and I was absolutely fine with him going and being a hero. And besides, I had my Nintendo Wii at the cabin, and I was happy to get in a bit of practice so I could kick Dad's ass at Wii Sports all that weekend. And so Dad drove off down the trail in his Jeep, and I just settled in for a late night of video games and worrying about my dad's safety. Now I tired myself out on Wii Sports, and then just settled to play some The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. The sun had set outside, and I thought about whoever was missing in the park, and hoped that Dad and the other rangers would be able to find them safely. And when I first heard creaking and movement on the porch outside, I assumed Dad was back and readied myself to greet him. The cabin was open plan, so I could see the front door from the living room. And that's when I realized that whoever was on the porch was not Dad. They were lurking around out there, doing something, but not unlocking the door or coming inside. And then my heart sank as I heard the door rattling. Someone was trying to open it, And it definitely wasn't my father, because he had a key. I got up off the couch and crept toward the door, hoping I could peer through the window and see something in the darkness. As soon as I got close, the rattling stopped, almost respectfully, and I sniffed. There was a certain scent, strong and impossible to ignore, and my eyes lit up. It smelled like a wet dog, musky and damp, exactly like Dad had described in his stories. Bigfoot. If it really was Bigfoot out there, then I knew I would be completely foolish to open the door and introduce myself to some 8 or 9 foot cryptid muscle man. So I kept my cool and simply stood near the door, breathing in that musky animal smell, when there were taps on the door. 1, 2, 3 taps, almost like a signal or a greeting. I might have been amazed by this, but then something on the other side of the cabin immediately pulled my attention away. Another sound followed, this time the splintering of wood. It was a far more aggressive and threatening noise, coming from the room at the back, a narrow corridor-like space, which meant I could hear exactly where it was coming from, but could not see what was causing it. Torn between a possible Bigfoot encounter and a possible intruder, I rushed to the door leading to the back room and leaned around the door frame. Sure enough, at the window was a very human-sized figure, clearly trying to work the window open with some kind of tool that had already splintered the wood and was now allowing the intruder to slide fingers into the gap and begin forcing it wider. I gasped in terror, and the figure must have heard me because he renewed his efforts to open the window. Without thinking, I shouted for help. The response was an angry roar from the other side of the cabin, followed by the thundering sound of distant footsteps. The figure at the window froze, immediately withdrew, and vanished. I ran to the window and could just make out faint movements of shadows outside in the moonlight. It was an incredibly dark night, and we had left the back porch lights off while I was alone, specifically to avoid drawing the attention of would-be criminals. I kept watching, and I am absolutely sure of what I saw. A second, much larger shadow came running from around the side of the cabin and past the glass as I hurried to close and relock the window, which I managed to do despite the damage to the frame. I guess it hadn't been closed properly in the first place, which was how the intruder had managed to get it partially open. I could hear running footsteps moving away from the cabin, and they sounded far too heavy to belong to any kind of man. Everything felt chaotic and terrifying. I'm not ashamed to say that I shut off all the lights, grabbed some pillows, and hid under the table in the living room for a while. Eventually, I think I drifted off to sleep, but something woke me again. In the still darkness, I could smell it once more. That disgusting, wet, musky dog scent. It was coming from the direction of the front door. In my half-asleep state, the smell made me feel strangely comforted, even though it was so pungent, like I somehow knew I was safe now. After that, I managed to drift back to sleep, exhausted from fear and the events of the night. I woke up again at what turned out to be around 7 a.m. Dad was letting himself in through the front door, and he looked surprised when he saw me crawl out from under the table. He was holding something in his hand and kept looking between it and me with confusion. I looked at it too and asked him what he was holding. He raised it and said he'd found it on the doorstep when he got back. It was a rock and a feather. He said they'd been placed neatly in front of the door, with the rock set on top of the feather, and they definitely hadn't been there when he'd left the night before. So I explained the events of the night to him as we sat at the table, both of us staring at the offerings that had been left on our doorstep. While I was dealing with my own experience, Dad had been involved in something else entirely. It turned out the search and rescue had started as a hiking disagreement that turned violent. Two hikers had argued, and one of them shoved the other down a small cliff before disappearing into the Gifford Range woods. Other hikers happened to witness it from a distance. The rangers had to locate the injured hiker and also try to track down his assailant. We became convinced that this man was the same person who had tried to break into the back window of the cabin. After attacking his companion, he must have made his way through the Gifford Range woods, found Dad's cabin, and decided he needed to break in. Whether he knew there was a kid in the cabin or not, we never truly knew. Probably not. It was clearly marked as a ranger's cabin, so he likely assumed the ranger was out assisting with search and rescue, or off handling something else. As for the other visitor, who can say? But someone, or something, chased that intruder away that night, and they smelled like a wet dog, and left an offering of a rock and a feather on my doorstep, as if to say they were watching out for me and had my back. Sure, it could have been a normal animal that scared off the assailant. The man disappeared into the wilderness, and as far as my dad was ever able to track, he was never caught. So we were never able to question him about whether he had been chased away by a Bigfoot. But I know what I believe, and I was there that night. I heard those footsteps and smelled that musk, and I was the one whose life was saved by the most unlikely of saviors. I believe, and my dad believed too, and we never had any encounters quite as close as that. But there was certainly other evidence that Bigfoots are more than just a myth in that area. As a kid, I grew up in foster care, so I have a lot of memories of being home alone. Most of them come from early homes I stayed in when I was very young, and there's only one that truly stands out as terrifying. But it ended up changing my life. Thankfully, it changed my life for the better, but at the time, it felt like it could be the end of everything. I had been placed with his family, the Harrisons, for about 3 weeks when this happened. I was coming off another stint in a group home, so at first, I was excited to be with a family again. But when I met the Harrisons, it became clear pretty quickly that they didn't care about me at all. I was just an excuse for them to collect an extra paycheck from the government. Thankfully, they weren't abusive. They were just negligent, which I would take over active abuse any day, even though it's terrible that those are the choices anyone has to accept. The Harrisons were actually nice to me in the way they behaved. They weren't especially mean or cruel, and they were pretty generous about letting me help myself to snacks or treats from the kitchen. I was an extremely shy and quiet 6-year-old girl who mostly liked to hide under my bed and read. So I suppose I was the perfect child for a couple like this. They wanted a kid they could foster who would stay quiet and stay inside while they went out and lived their lives. That was me. I never got in trouble, never stood up for myself, and never really did anything defiant, at least not when I was that young. After a couple of days, the Harrisons started leaving me alone in the house almost every evening. Honestly, this was fine by me. I was a very self-sufficient 6-year-old. I had to be, growing up in care. And at the time, it felt like bliss to be trusted to quietly house-sit on my own, free to eat as many snacks as I wanted, with the only real concern being making sure I didn't get into trouble. Sometimes I wonder how long I would have stayed with the Harrisons, being poorly and negligently non-parented, if the following event hadn't happened. As I said, I'd been there for a few weeks, and it was yet another night where I was left on my own. I was watching TV in the living room when there was a knock at the door. The house was in a North Alder Estates, better than what I was used to, but still a bit sketchy in hindsight. To me, though, it felt like a palace, and the fact that the Harrisons felt comfortable leaving me alone all night made me assume it had to be safe. Even so, I knew better than to answer the door when I was home alone. Thomas Harrison reminded me of this every single time they went out for the evening and left me there. Don't cause any damage. Don't answer the door. Don't forget to brush your teeth before bed. Always those same 3 things. There had never been a knock at the door before when I was home alone. So even though I had no intention of answering it, I crept into the hallway just to listen. I remembered that there was no way for anyone standing on the front porch to see inside and see me, and that made me feel emboldened. I guess the guy outside heard the floorboards creak or something, because he seemed to know the moment I stepped into the hallway. He called out to me, and his voice was kind and gentle, and I wondered if maybe it was not anything to worry about. He said he was from CPS, and that he was there to check on me and see if everything was going okay at my new foster home. I did not reply, because I knew the Harrisons would be in trouble if CPS found out they had left me alone at night, and I really wanted to stay in this home where I was basically ignored and left to my own devices to read and watch cartoons. The guy outside kept talking, saying that he knew I was in there and that I should just open the door and let him in so he could check that everything was fine. So I crept over to the other side of the hallway by the stairs and sat down on the steps. Then the guy said that he had left something behind when he visited before, and that the Harrisons would want me to let him in. In fact, he said they told him to tell me to let him in. He used their full names too, which made me start doubting myself. I finally asked him to repeat who he was, and this time he said he was a friend of the family, and that the Harrisons had asked him to stop by to check if I was okay. Now, I may have been 6 years old and quiet, but I was not stupid. This guy had claimed he was from CPS, and now he was saying he was a friend of the family? So I quietly said that I could not let him in because the Harrisons had told me never to answer the door for strangers. At first, the guy said this was good and that I was a good girl for listening. He said they had wanted to test that I was sensible and could be trusted. Then he started insisting that now the test was done, I could let him in so he could quickly grab his wallet that he had left behind. I replied that I was very sorry, but I was not able to do that. This was a mistake. It caused the guy to explode with rage. It was so sudden and terrifying that I can still remember the exact sound of him suddenly punching or slamming into the front door. I remember the burst of anger and the horrible things he screamed at me through the door, things I cannot even repeat in the story, along with calling me a brat, a bad child, a horrible little C word, and worse. Obviously, this completely upset and terrified me, and my instinct when I was scared was to find the nearest closet and hide inside. Fortunately, I had a closet in my room at the Harrisons, so I ran upstairs and hid there. Less fortunately, the location of my room meant that I could still hear the guy at the front door. He was bashing and shouting, hurling all sorts of upsetting insults at me. This went on for what felt like hours. Maybe it really was. At one point, it sounded like he was trying to pick the lock or do something to break in. I sat there in the closet, shivering and crying, as this man I didn't know and had never seen before made the most vile threats. I had no idea if or when he might get inside, and if he did, then surely it would only be a matter of time before he found me. Eventually, I heard another voice besides his, and then another. It sounded like the Harrisons. Then there was angry screaming and several loud bangs from outside. Not gunshot-type bangs, but more like wood striking wood or something being smashed. I started crying harder, terrified that something awful was happening to the Harrisons. When I finally heard the front door open, it was followed by a sudden silence and calm. Then it slammed shut, and relief washed over me as I heard Janice Harrison calling out for me, asking where I was. I stayed in the closet for a while, too scared to reply or speak. Both of the Harrisons called to me, not kindly, but not angrily either, just sounding like it was all too annoying to deal with. Eventually, Thomas Harrison found me in the closet and told me to come out, saying that everything was fine now. I was too terrified to ask them anything about the incident, and for their part, they certainly weren't offering any information. Instead, Thomas Harrison seemed almost angry with me, and that scared me even more. I didn't want to push or ask for any further information, even though, secretly, I was desperate to know who the man was and what had happened to him. The next day, Thomas Harrison was gone when I woke up, and only Janice Harrison was at home. She made me breakfast and didn't comment on the night's events at all. Nor did she tell me what was about to happen. When the knock at the door came, I was surprised to see that it was Ms. Calder, there to take me back to the group home. Apparently, no explanation was given, and Janice Harrison wouldn't even look me in the eye when she said goodbye and wished me luck with the rest of my life. Now, I was too shy and scared to even ask why I was being returned to the group home. But as my caseworker gave me a ride back, I mentioned that a man had come to the Harrisons' house the night before, and she said, "I know, sweetie," then gently ruffled my hair. So I knew that whatever led to my removal from the Harrisons' house involved that man. And to this day, I have no idea who he was, or how or why CPS found out and removed me from that family. I never saw the Harrisons again, and I could never find anything about them when I tried looking them up years later, just out of curiosity. I spent a few more months in that group home until I was eventually fostered by a family who later adopted me and who I now consider to be my real family. Like I said at the start, most children in the foster care system aren't as lucky as me. Some of them end up face to face with a man like the one who threatened me through the door, and aren't lucky enough to be removed from their terrible situation. Years later, a small part of me still desperately wants to know who that man was and what he had planned for me. But a much bigger part of me can probably guess what kind of man he was. And that part of me is grateful that I'll never have to know. So when I was a kid, it became a tradition for a few of us cousins to stay with Margaret over summer vacation. Margaret was my mom's mom, and there were 4 of us cousins on my mom's side. Although I had 6 maternal cousins in total, we crossed into each other's lives every summer through Margaret, and it became a seasonal event I always looked forward to. Sometimes one of us would be staying at Margaret's alone, depending on timing and what one family might be doing or which summer trips they had planned. That summer, there was a period of 5 days when I found myself staying alone with Margaret. Now, this hadn't been planned. Usually, those summer visits with Margaret were meant for all of us cousins to spend time together. That week, the plan had been for my cousins, Saffron and Bryant, to be there too. But due to some kind of mistake with hotel bookings, they ended up arriving later. I didn't mind spending a few days alone with Margaret. We always had fun there, whether other cousins were around or not. But this explains why, on one night that week, I was left alone in Margaret's house while she went to her usual weekly bingo. Normally, Margaret tried to avoid leaving any of us home alone, but this time I assured her it would be absolutely fine. I was 12 by then, practically a man in my own mind, and I planned to relax and watch television or play on my Nintendo DS Lite while she went out to bingo. She would only be gone for 4 or 5 hours, which seemed harmless enough at the time. I later learned how much could go wrong in that span, and what happened was enough to shatter my trust in other people for years afterward. Margaret had been gone for about half an hour, though it felt more like 5 minutes because I was absorbed in my video games. She had walked into town for bingo after giving up driving a few years earlier, so when the doorbell rang, I didn't think twice about answering it. I assumed she had forgotten her keys, since I hadn't really registered how much time had passed since she left. When I pulled the door open with a smile ready for Margaret, and instead saw a young woman on the doorstep, I suddenly remembered that I wasn't supposed to answer the door to strangers while home alone. That realization came too late, after I had already opened it without hesitation. The young woman immediately stepped inside, gave me a small hug, and closed the door behind her. I stood there, stunned, taken aback by this cool-looking girl acting so familiar as she hugged me and pushed her way into Margaret's house. She reacted with a kind of mock hurt and told me she was shocked that I didn't remember her, explaining that she was Elaine, my cousin, Uncle Jim's daughter and Martin's sister. Then it clicked, because Martin was the cousin who often stayed at Margaret's house with us. There was me, and then Saffron and Bryant, who were Aunt Yvette's kids, and Martin, who was Uncle Jim's son. Martin also had two older siblings who were too old to stay at Margaret's with us. One of them, Fred, was much older and already had a child, and we saw him at family events, but I had completely forgotten about Elaine. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen my cousin Elaine, but standing there, I could tell without a doubt that it was her. She had gotten taller and older and more emotional looking in the few years since I'd last seen her, and I tried to figure how old she must be now, maybe 18 or 19. Elaine walked into Margaret's living room and dropped a full-looking duffel bag onto the couch. She began looking around, almost as if she were searching for Margaret. I explained that Margaret was out at bingo and wouldn't be back until later. Elaine acted disappointed and said she'd miss Margaret, but added that she was staying overnight, so it was fine, and she'd see her when she got back. There was absolutely nothing that made me feel like I shouldn't trust Elaine. There were even photographs of her on the living room wall, even if she looked a little different in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. This was definitely my cousin Elaine. She started asking me about Mom and how we were doing. It confused me because she didn't seem to know that Mom and Dad had gotten divorced a couple of years earlier. But then she made a big show of apologizing and acted genuinely sorry for forgetting. There was no real reason she should have remembered anyway, since I'd barely remembered who she was myself. After about an hour of hanging out, Elaine asked if I remembered when we used to play hide-and-seek in Margaret's house when I was little. I vaguely remembered it, and Grandpa Walter had still been alive back then, and Margaret's big house had seemed even bigger to me as a kid. I started to worry that Elaine was going to ask me to play hide-and-seek again, which felt distinctly uncool for a 12-year-old. Instead, she asked if I remembered the time she hid in the basement and none of us could find her for hours. I said I didn't remember that at all, because I honestly didn't. Elaine told me that back then, all of us kids had been terrified of the basement except for her, and that she was the only one brave enough to go down there and hide. I laughed and said that Margaret's basement didn't scare me anymore, and that I didn't remember being afraid of it as a kid. Elaine laughed and said I had been so scared of the basement that I'd cried when the door was left open. I didn't remember that either, and I just laughed it off. Then Elaine said she dared me to go down there. I think I shrugged and asked why. She really played it up, talking about how scared all of us cousins used to be of the basement. Then she dared me with $10 to go down into the basement to prove that I wasn't scared of it anymore. Now, please remember at this point, no matter how much of an obviously suspicious red flag this seems, A, I was 12 years old, and B, I had no reason to distrust my slightly older cousin, even if she had shown up unexpectedly at Margaret's house. All I had were good, slightly hazy memories of hanging out with Elaine when we were younger, and I had no reason to read anything deeper into it. I thought my cousin was just being goofy, and that I'd forgotten the lore of the basement. I also really wanted $10, and Margaret's basement wasn't even slightly spooky. It was just a normal food storage basement, and going down there was an easy $10. I only realized how badly I'd screwed up when I reached the bottom. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the sound of a key clunking in the lock. I still thought Elaine was pranking me, even as more and more time passed, and I remained trapped down there, with no way out. I didn't entertain the idea that anything too bad was happening. When hour 2 crept up, though, and then hour 3, and hour 4, I knew something was very wrong. I was desperate to pee, and my throat was hoarse from screaming for help and calling for Elaine or Margaret or anyone. I would never have admitted this at the time, but now, as an adult, I'm fine with admitting that I cried so much that I developed a headache and spent the entire time I was trapped in the basement begging and pleading with Elaine to let me out. It felt like I'd been down there for 100 years when I finally heard the sound of the door being unlocked and Margaret's voice calling down to me. She sounded old, frail, and panicked. I rushed up the basement stairs, hugged Margaret, and collapsed, sobbing, onto the living room couch. Margaret asked me what had happened, and eventually I choked out the explanation that cousin Elaine had come over. I'd let her in, and she'd locked me in the basement. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and she kept asking me over and over if I was absolutely sure it was Elaine, our cousin Elaine, Uncle Jim's daughter. I said yes. I was pretty sure that's who she said she was. But why had she locked me in the basement? At first, Margaret didn't know, but then she went to check something, and when she came back, I could see that she was pale and shaking. To this day, I still do not know exactly what Elaine stole from Margaret. She took that secret to her grave, and it led to some very heated exchanges between the families, because whatever it was presumably held significant value and would have been an important part of the inheritance when Margaret passed. I managed to piece together some of the story over the years, though Elaine had been estranged from Uncle Jim and Aunt Leslie since she was 15 or 16. She had fallen in with a bad crowd and developed some extremely bad habits. And, well, you can probably guess the rest. Margaret and the other adults hid it from us that our cousin Elaine had become wayward. And this meant that I was not prepared when she showed up at Margaret's house that night. The theory is that she had been watching the place and knew that I was alone there, and that she would be able to get in simply by gaining my trust. The strange thing is that I am very grateful she locked me in the basement. The reason for that is an item Elaine left behind in Margaret's living room. I only heard about this from cousin Martin, Elaine's brother, many years later, since Margaret was never able to explain why Elaine had left a hammer on the cabinet, which she must have brought with her. Martin shared his theory when he told me about it some years later, though. He believes Elaine was planning to crack me over the head with that hammer if her plan failed and she could not get me into the basement. I have no idea if this is true, and no one in the family has ever heard from Elaine again. As far as I know, she is still out there, living off whatever she stole from Margaret all those years ago. Margaret passed away a few years ago now. During the last part of her life, Elaine became a kind of family secret that nobody directly referenced. A sad way for a person's life to unfold when you think about it. For me, it also marks the end of childhood and the end of summer vacations at Margaret's. At least, all I had to endure was a few hours locked in a brightly lit basement and not a hammer to my skull. To set the scene, I am female, and this happened when I was in my late teens. It was around 2008. I was still in high school. My parents attended some kind of charity event. That meant they were both out together that night. The evening passed without any major incidents at first, but after an hour or so of being home alone, I started to receive the calls. Caller ID showed that it was coming from a blocked number, of course. And I'm not really sure why I even answered the first call because of that. I should have just ignored it, but I guess I was mostly curious. Or maybe I didn't notice the lack of caller ID because I picked up in a cheerful tone and said, "Hello, this is..." And then I said, "My parents' residence. How can I help you?" Something like that. I forget the exact order of the calls because they all blur together in my memory as terrifying. But the first few calls involved a caller with a deep, robotic-sounding voice describing what I was wearing and then what I was doing in the downstairs living room and in the kitchen. It sounded like something out of Scream, but there was something far more mundane and seedy about it when it was happening in real life. Just this creepy guy with some kind of voice modulator making it painfully clear that he could see me. It's thrilling and scary in certain ways in the movies, but when it's happening to you, it really does not feel good. It made me feel dirty and intruded upon. And I guess that's why I started acting irrationally. I would scream at him to leave me alone and then hang up the phone, only to answer again every time he called back. I know it sounds dumb. I could have just let the phone ring until it stopped, but consider what was going through my head at the time. There was a guy prank calling me who could somehow see me, and I wanted to know how much danger I was really in. As he kept calling, I darted around the house, closing the blinds and making sure the windows and doors were locked. At that point, I didn't consider calling the cops because the guy hadn't actually threatened me. He was just stating that he could see me and stating what I was doing. It was incredibly strange. It wasn't like some heavy breathing or anything like that. He would just call and say, "You're wearing a white t-shirt, and I see you just changed the channel." Things like that. And I was worried about wasting the cops' time if I reported it, which, looking back, feels pretty stupid. And even to this day, I'm not convinced they would have taken me seriously back then. And so I got stuck in this kind of loop where every time the phone beeped, I felt this sick dread settle in my stomach. But I couldn't stop myself from answering it either. And the more I let him speak, the more I started to piece things together from what this guy was saying. He could only see me on the first floor. If I went upstairs, he lost sight of me and would hang up the phone. If I had wanted to avoid being seen, I could have stayed upstairs, and maybe I would have thought to call the cops. But I got it into my head that I should try baiting the guy. That way, I would have something more concrete to go on. Now, as an adult, I know it was very stupid of me to let it play out like that, and I should have handled it completely differently. I was bullheaded and fiery as a kid, and I felt insulted that this guy was creeping on me. And I guess that even though it was making me deeply uncomfortable, there was a degree of childish intrigue in letting the events continue. Eventually, I had all the curtains and blinds downstairs closed. I was confident there was absolutely no way this guy could be looking through any window of my house. Yet the calls kept coming. The phone would ring, and he would state matter-of-factly what I was doing. I was changing the channel on the TV, and I was getting a glass of water. Very weird and mundane things to be creeped on about. I started asking him what he was getting out of all this, and he would not respond. It was so strange and awkward, and I think that is what began to genuinely scare me more than if the calls had been filled with threats or innuendo. It felt like he had decided to do this to creep on me and spy on me for some reason, but then had no idea why he wanted to do it once he was actually doing it. I do not know if that makes sense, or if I am just thinking about it after the fact, but I got the impression these calls were not his big, creepy plan. It was just something he felt compelled to do, on top of something else he had already done. I decided not to answer the calls for a while and see what would happen. He kept calling incessantly, to the point where the ringtone would not stop. As soon as one call ended, he would call again, and again, and again. In the end, it made me so mad and upset that I answered again. Before he could say anything, I demanded to know how he could see me. That was when he replied with a line that made my blood run cold. "I'm in the house with you." He even said, "Ha ha," in a flat, deadpan monotone. Of course, I knew he couldn't actually be in the house. I would have heard him talking, for one thing, and I checked all the closets, corners, and possible hiding spots. But it was still absolutely terrifying to hear as a teenage girl home alone. I started trying to think about it as if he really were in the house. Were there any clues to how he could be watching me? I tried to remember all the different things he had seen throughout the night. I realized that everything he mentioned was either in the living room or in the kitchen doorway. Whatever window he was watching me through would have given him a view of almost the entire living room. He had also commented earlier on the fact that I had almost spilled water as I came in from the kitchen. That sudden detail made something click. The idea felt familiar, that there was a view of the living room where the kitchen doorway was clearly visible. That was when I remembered the angle matched the Logitech-era USB webcam. At the time, this was the late 2000s, and the idea that hackers could watch you through your webcam was still fairly new. I ran to the family computer and unplugged the bulky webcam we had back then, and the call immediately stopped. That alone was enough to confirm it for me. This creep had somehow accessed our family's PC webcam and could see me. In some ways, that realization made me feel better. It was probably just some internet weirdo who was nowhere near me and had no idea where I lived or who I was. That felt easier to accept than the thought of a stalker outside my house. Still, knowing someone had been watching me through the family computer made me feel sick. In the end, a family friend ran a scan and found that something had been downloaded onto our PC sometime during the previous week. We never figured out which family member had installed it by accident, but I'm fairly sure it was my younger brother, who was always downloading strange things back then. He was 12 at the time, and we did report the incident to the police. This was back in 2008 though, and cybercrime wasn't something they took very seriously. I also downplayed what had happened by not admitting how many times I had answered the phone or how poorly I had handled the situation. Even now, I'm grateful that the only place that hacker could see was our living room. The idea that someone could spy on me through the laptop in my bedroom made me so paranoid that I started keeping tape over the webcams on all my devices and never stopped. I never found out who the strange hacker caller was, or ever confirmed for sure that he was just some internet weirdo who had access to my webcam and somehow linked it to a phone number. That explanation was the only one that let me sleep at night. It has been nearly 20 years since then, and I still tape over my webcams to this day, and I make sure my own kids are extremely safety conscious when using the internet, because you never know what kind of weirdos are out there. I am a girl, and I met guys online in the early 2000s, back when it was still considered risky and dangerous to meet people on the internet. Looking back, it was probably a good thing that some online friendships were seen as inadvisable, because there have always been some serious weirdos around. Back then, people were only starting to discover computers and what they could really do. One guy added me on EarlyM, an old instant messaging program. EarlyM had a feature that let you add a random person, selecting another user at random and allowing you to message them. As far as I ever knew, there was no way to tell the difference between someone who added you by typing in your username and someone who added you through a random request. Because of that, I had a mix of friends on there. Some I only knew through EarlyM, and a few real-life school friends I talked to through the service. One guy on my friends list, who I will just call Steve, was a pretty cool and funny guy. We did not really know each other that well, and I had no idea how he had added me, and I never really thought to ask. It was not something that seemed important back then. You collected internet weirdos who were just kind of there in your life, and after a while, you did not even remember how you had met them. Steve would send me dumb jokes and early memes, before we even called them memes. Sometimes he would recommend cool new music for me to download from PeerShare or WireDrop, or whatever other strange programs we were using at the time. He was one of those people you meet online who seems cool, funny, and mysterious. You keep the conversations from getting too personal because you are both too cool to go there. Most people who grew up as a loser, introverted online teen in the 90s and 2000s, like me, will probably know exactly the vibe I'm talking about. Or at least, I hope so. One day, I was home alone because my parents were out of town. I was in what I think was my junior year of high school, or maybe the very start of senior year. And it must have been the start of senior year because it was October. It came as a huge surprise when, completely out of the blue, my internet friend Steve messaged me saying he was going to come over that night since I was home alone, or something along those lines. As far as I knew, I had never even told Steve which city I lived in, let alone my exact address, and I had definitely never told him my parents were out of town. I assumed it had to be a joke or a strange coincidence, so I replied with LOL or something similar, and waited to see what he'd say. Steve replied that he was serious and that he really was going to come over. I scrolled back through our messages to see if I had casually mentioned being alone for the weekend at some point, but I hadn't. I didn't want to mess up my friendship with Steve because, at the time, I thought he was cool and funny. I tried to play it cool myself and act like I was going along with the joke. I asked him how he knew my address, but I tried to phrase it like I was kidding. That kind of thing was hard to pull off over text, but we were pretty good at it back then. Steve suddenly got serious and said he'd been wanting to tell me for a while, but that we actually went to the same high school and that he hadn't added me randomly online. He said he could tell I thought he was just some random guy from the internet, but that we actually knew each other in real life. That made the hair on the back of my neck start to rise. But I still assumed he was joking, because this was exactly the kind of prank we used to play on each other. Then Steve replied with a list of things he could only have known if he really did know me in person. Details about me, my high school, and other specific stuff. That was when I started to feel genuinely freaked out, because either Steve was some kind of hacker, or he really was someone I knew in real life who had never admitted it until now. Even then, though, he hadn't technically done anything wrong, except for saying he was coming over, which still could have been a joke. So I asked him about that, and he said no, he was serious, because he wanted to talk to me about things face to face. I said that he should not come over, at least not without telling me who he actually was first. Steve said this was the problem. He did not want to tell me who he was unless he could do it in person, because he had feelings for me, and he was worried that I would react badly if I knew who he was. So he wanted to explain himself to me in person. I asked him why it would be better if he could tell me in person, and he just said that it would be, and then refused to clarify any further. So I started getting more and more angry and freaked out by this. I could not explain why, but it felt like he had led me on somehow. You would have had to see our conversations back then. He definitely acted like someone who did not know me in real life up until that point. It felt deceptive. Besides, I'd kind of gotten it into my head that Steve was Andy in real life, this skater kid from high school who had a crush on me in sophomore year and had been a bit overly persistent until I told him to chill out. Andy was the only person I could think of from high school who might want or need to explain himself to me face to face about hanging out with me. It also pissed me off that he decided to reveal all of this by making it clear that he knew my parents were out of town. It felt like a strange power play, and considering that I had not told anyone about my parents going out of town, it was information that had to have been obtained in a creepy way, at least in my mind. In my head, my friend Internet Steve had just revealed that he had been high school Andy this whole time, someone I was not attracted to at all and had rejected before. And now he wanted to come over and hang out because my parents were out of town. I was not okay with that. I decided we should end it there and forget it ever happened, and then I blocked him. It sucked to lose that Internet Steve person as a friend, but I had to keep reminding myself that he was not Internet Steve at all. He was somebody in real life, and probably Andy, and I fully expected that to be the end of it. When my doorbell rang 15 or so minutes later, I did not even entertain the idea that it could be Steve or Andy. By the time I got downstairs, though, I had put two and two together and started to freak out. What if Andy was just standing there on my doorstep, asking to be let in? He was a big guy. He could easily overpower me if he wanted to. My front door back then was the kind where you could see the vague outline of a person through the frosted glass. Or, as was the case here, you could see where there was not a person at the front door. So I crept to the peephole and looked out. There was nobody standing there, but I could very clearly see the word spray painted across my driveway. So Internet Steve really was a local person, and was not above making threatening gestures the moment he got rejected. I was very glad that I went with my gut and blocked him. The next step was doing something about it, though. Being a very awkward teen, I realized that I did not want to have to deal with my parents or the cops over that incident. I knew that I would get blamed for giving our home address to strangers, no matter how much I tried to explain that Steve had to be a local person. So, I scrubbed the graffiti off our driveway that weekend before my parents got home and never mentioned it to them. Naive, I know, but I am still convinced that I saved myself a lot of unnecessary drama. The next stage involved confronting Andy at school. I did this the following Monday, backed up by 2 friends, and I walked up to him and demanded to know what he had been doing on Friday night. About 5 or 6 of his friends all said skate park at once, and Andy just looked at me, confused. Apparently, Andy had pulled off some notably epic skating trick at a late-night contest at the park that previous Friday night, and his buddies thought I had heard about it and was asking about that. Thankfully, this gave me cover to pretend that was what I was talking about, instead of having to explain the whole story about the graffiti and Internet Steve. So I played it off like I was impressed by hearing about Andy's skate trick, and then skirted away, embarrassed and none the wiser as to who Internet Steve really was. Andy found me later that day and asked what had really been behind my question earlier. I guess he could tell that something was genuinely bothering me. We weren't friends or anything. He'd been a little pestering when he had a crush on me sophomore year, but I didn't hate him or anything. I just told him straight out that a guy on my earlium friends list had threatened me and hinted that he'd once had a crush on me. Andy laughed and said it was far from the only time someone had ever had a crush on me, which made me feel like a jerk. But then he was actually pretty sweet about it, genuinely concerned for my well-being, and said he'd ask around to see if he could dig up any information or hear any gossip about who Internet Steve might really have been. Unfortunately, Andy never found out, and I think I know why. I've never been able to prove who Internet Steve was. In some ways, I think it's for the best that I never knew, because it would have opened up a huge amount of trouble if it had come out back then and I'd confronted the person. You see, I'm 99% sure that Internet Steve was actually my history teacher. It would explain why he wanted to see me face to face to explain himself, why he refused to tell me who he was online, and why everything about it felt so wrong. What's truly horrifying is the idea that a grown adult, a teacher no less, was talking to a high school girl online and then, after she blocked him, wrote an insult on her driveway in spray paint. That teacher was younger, probably in his late 20s, and he and I got along fairly well. I admit, I had a small crush on him, but I was a teenage girl, and it was an adult teacher's responsibility to dismiss that kind of thing. We had always been pretty chatty at school, talking about music, movies, and books, in that familiar dynamic of a cool teacher and an awkward student. But after the incident with Internet Steve, that history teacher started acting very strange toward me. He became extremely distant and cold, and on a few occasions, he even scolded me or snapped at me. He was the only person in my life who treated me differently immediately after I blocked Internet Steve. To this day, I am certain it was him. I wish I had been able to prove it, but it was one of those things you don't fully recognize at the time. It only really dawned on me at graduation when I finally thought everything through. I went off to college the next year, and there was nothing I could do to prove that teacher was Internet Steve. So all I can do is hope that whoever it was never escalated beyond being a strange creep who threatened girls with graffiti, because with someone like that, there is no telling how far they might go.